Hello, I'm Paul Gilbert, and I'm president of the Compassionate Mind Foundation. And today I'm delighted to welcome George Bell to our interviews of Creating a Compassionate World. And he's written this amazing book on masculinity. So just tell you a little bit about him, and then we can engage his ideas about how we can deal with some of the challenges of masculinity. George is the author of Be a Man About It, Building a Healthier Idea of Masculinity, where he looks at the enormous expectations placed on boys and men and what we can do about it. Now, this book came from a place of a deep personal struggle George had with his own mental health in 2016, which led him to almost taking his own life. He spent almost a decade working in the mental health space, helping to open up conversations around shame, silence, and the pressures that men face, and has worked with numerous businesses and organizations on their well-being strategies, including the BBC, Red Bull, Metropolitan Police, NatWest, Avia, Nationwide, Bupa, and Just Eat and more. He lives in London and is dedicated to creating a happier, more compassionate world for everyone, which I think is just wonderful. And I actually met George when he was working for Jack, which is a mental health charity where you can ask her questions and then you go onto the app and people will come up and answer them for you. And George has always been very interested in the compassionate dynamic because that's what I was talking to Jack about. So, George, welcome to Creating a Compassionate World, and tell us a little bit. So, how did you get started on this journey of writing your book?
Paul, thank you very much for having me here today. Really, really good to be chatting to you. And yeah, the journey is a long journey. I think the book it's definitely got a professional interest for me. Professionally, I'm very interested in this challenge we face around men and mental health more widely. But that professional interest was born out of a personal struggle, as you read in the biography. Just over 10 years ago, I was really struggling with my mental health. I'd got to a place of just real struggle and a real kind of hole. I just felt like I was in a hole with my mental health, and it felt like a hole that I couldn't see a way out of. It didn't feel like one that I could climb out of. But I ignored that. I ignored the way I was feeling. I didn't do anything with that. I sort of just told myself that if I ignored it, it would go, basically. Obviously knowing what I know now about mental health and how it works, I wouldn't have done the same thing that I did back then, which was ignore it. But what that ignoring did, turned it into a period of wanting to take my own life. That was where it sort of led to, because I just felt like I was completely broken. I felt like I wasn't a real man. I told myself that men aren't meant to feel this way. I'm not meant to feel this kind of anguish and pain and whatever. So I felt like a failure as a man. So that obviously in itself was a challenge. But then the added challenge that it all just compounded was that because I was a man, I didn't think I could talk about that either. I thought that I was a failure of a man, and I was it was then done. I couldn't open up about it because I'd be even more of a failure. So despite feeling all of this stuff, despite wanting to take my own life, and despite having an amazing group of people around me, I had a really good group of mates, family, I had a really supportive girlfriend. I believed that I couldn't tell any of them what I was going through. And again, looking back now, I know that if I had just said something, I would have found nothing but love and support there from a group of people that really, really wanted to help me. But I'd almost been tricked into believing that I couldn't talk about this stuff. So that's really where this started for me, and that created this passion, this desire to do something in the space, because I know that my story isn't unique. I know that hundreds of thousands of men, sadly, are facing a similar thing around the world every single day. So that that's my why. That's always been my why, and that was the why behind the book as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I suppose what happens for men, isn't it? They have a sense of disappointment in themselves because they've been set up to believe they should be this or they should be that, I should feel this, should do this. And therefore, there's a real sense where you think, hang on a minute, but I can't, I can't do that. And then there's that sort of anger towards the self. I mean, did you feel disappointed in yourself, or you were letting yourself down, or
Yeah, for sure. I felt like I was letting everyone down. Felt like I'd let my
um,
parents down. Felt like I was letting myself down. And I think the thing that was challenging is that I almost told myself that that was it. I'd I'd failed, and there was almost no chance of redemption or coming back from that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and I think, that was such an unhealthy mindset to get into. And I just think the added pressure I was putting onto myself because of the way I was feeling. If you're dealing with a mental health challenge, that is challenging enough as it is. The last thing you need to be doing is berating yourself and shaming
absolutely,
yourself. And
absolutely.
it was all just compounding on top of each other.
That's such an important point that you actually, you turn in against yourself. And I mean, as you in compassion focused therapy, we say that people often have the big three. So there can be an element of anger, sadness, and fear. There's a part
Mm.
that we get into these states of mind because I had suicidal depression many years ago, and you just get angry. You just think, fuck this, just fuck
Yeah.
this. I've
Yeah.
fucking had enough. And there's that rage, and you don't know what to do with that rage because you're also feeling very lonely and you're also feeling very frightened, and all of these emotions are just going around in your head. And then you just say, okay, I want out. I just want out. And it's such a painful position. And that's why what you're saying, I think, is so important because helping people think about that these states of mind are just chaotic and they just, they really, really persecute you. But what you pointed out, I think the most important thing is the way out is to own them, not to be ashamed of them, actually to own them, say, well, if this is the way it is, I'm going to have the courage to face them. I'm going to have the courage to work with them, which is what you've done in a brilliant way, I think, in your book. Say, okay, let's just face all this shit going on in my head and see where we get. And the other point that I think you make in your book, which is really important, is learning how to open up, how to start trusting people, and how to see that what you're experiencing is a human experience. It's not a failure. It's a human experience. If anything's failed, it's the pressures of masculinity that have been put on you. That's where the failure is, outside of you. It's not inside of you. So I think the way you talk about this in the book is just wonderful. So how did that begin to unfold, and what were your steps to gradual recovery or finding yourself and finding this way to write this book?
I was really lucky that I had two women in my life that intervened. So the first person was my girlfriend at the time, who she called me out for abnormal behavior. She told me that I'd become withdrawn and cold and distant, which
Yeah,
meant I was being kind of rude to her. She was getting the brunt of my anger, really, which I, you know, I was so all consumed about what was going on in my head that you're not conscious of what's really going on around you. So in my mind, I was doing a really good job of keeping my two worlds separate, where I believed I was keeping my mask up, and that when I was with people, I was happy and confident. I was being the man I was meant to be, quote unquote. And that on my own, I would then let the mask slip. But I think when she called me out for the way I was being, yeah, it was being confronted right then with the fact that, okay, well, the two worlds are actually colliding, and this is impacting other people. And so I sort of knew I had to open up in that moment, and I did. It wasn't very articulate. I didn't have the knowledge and the literacy around mental health and the way I was feeling and emotions and all this kind of stuff. I think I just said something like, my mind feels weird, or my mind feels a bit off. It was something like that. But it didn't really matter that I didn't have the words. I think what was important was that the conversation had then started. For the very, very first time with this, I had vocalized the way I was feeling. And that just sort of kick-started a chain of events where she told my mum. So my mum got involved. She took me down the doctors. I then had a diagnosis. Got diagnosis of depression, anxiety, which, you know, I have feelings around labels, both kind of good and bad. But I think what was important is I then had a label, like I had something that was helping me to understand what was going on inside. And I think just then, gradually, these steps helped to lower down the barriers and the boundaries that I'd created around seeking help and around talking about this stuff. Because I think every time something happened, it was kind of a proof point that maybe I could talk about this stuff and the world wasn't going to collapse. I'd built up these stories that men don't talk about this, and if they do, their failures as men, they'll be kind of kicked out of the family home, kicked out of the friendship group, whatever it might be. But actually, it's like I was sort of dipping a toe in the water when I told my girlfriend, and she was really supportive. That was just a little proof point of, okay, maybe this stuff isn't as scary as I've made it. And I think I just gradually worked that like a muscle. Eventually built up the courage to go to therapy, then started telling more friends in my friendship circle, and everything just kind of built from that point. And I think it then allowed me to kind of go further into this subject and to learn more about it. I did a lot of kind of self-learning around mental health and particularly around emotions. You touched on it earlier where you said this is a human thing, and that was a big part of my recovery was changing my relationship to my emotions. I think we've really unhelpfully labeled emotions good or bad. We've lumped them into those categories, and then particularly for men, we have conditioned and tricked men into believing that they can be fine, fine slash happy, or they can be angry, and that's kind of it. That's all that's really socially acceptable for men, and anything else we've labeled as weak or wrong or unmasculine. So I think when I was feeling all this stuff, the sadness, the depression, the low mood, I was fighting against myself with that. And then, when I actually learned that whatever emotion I'm feeling, good or bad, however it makes me feel, it's there for a reason. It's serving a purpose, and it's only by working with it and sitting with it and reflecting on it that I can and kind of move through it. And so that was a big turning point for me, because for a long, long time I was fighting against my depression, fighting against the anxiety. I
Mhm.
told myself that if I just did the masculine thing, if I fought harder, I'd crush it and I'd win. And of course, as I fought harder, the emotion got stronger as well. Whereas when I, settled a bit more and worked with it, I'm not saying it was easy. I'm not saying suddenly I was sort of partying with my anxiety and low mood. It's still not a nice feeling. But when I learned to kind of accept it and understand what it was telling me, I felt then I was able to move through it. So it was the combination of those two things really that sparked my recovery.
I think that's brilliant. And I mean, the courage to do that, because we often say there are two types of courage. One is physical courage, and men often have that. Firefighters will risk their lives. Men that can be incredibly compassionate when it comes to doing things like that. The courage to face the internal world, courage to face the fear within, the courage to face all those other emotions, that's a little bit more tricky. And that's partly because, as you point out in your book, men have been told, well, we don't need to teach you that because you shouldn't even have it. So that's a problem, right? So learning that actually, no, this is how minds work. Minds do create these experiences of rage and fear and loneliness. Because I think loneliness, a sense of disconnection, being on your own with it, this isolation in one's head, that's a terribly painful thing for men. And men do struggle to talk about, I feel so lonely.
Yeah. Yeah, and like loneliness is a weird one because you can be surrounded by so many
Yeah,
people. At the
yeah, yeah,
time I
yeah,
had
yeah,
I had no shortage of connections, but I felt so lonely because I was
yeah,
carrying this weight on my own. So
yeah,
I felt alone with it. And I think, that is another thing. We talk about these things that compounds how you're feeling. That was just another thing. I had my mental health issues. I was shaming myself for it. I felt like a failure. Then I felt lonely, and it was just this kind of hurricane of emotion that I was not prepared to deal with, and I told myself I wasn't allowed to deal with it or carry it. And it was just, yeah, it was almost too much to carry. I was 20, 21, I was still young. I was still a baby really in many ways. And I just think it was so much to handle. And again, being a man, I thought I had to handle it on my own. I thought I had to carry that burden on my own. That's what a lot of men sadly think. You think it's theirs alone to bear that burden. And as you and I know, that's costing a lot of men their lives.
yeah, absolutely. A lot of men. And because they're not educated about how the brain actually works, they're not educated about understanding how you learn to drive your mind. You're just left to discover it. And one of the reasons that all this happens is because basically it's a hangover for what we call the warrior nation. because we're not really evolved to be warriors. Oh, yes, we go out and hunt and stuff like that and risk our lives, fighting lions or, hunting prey and so forth and so forth. But actually, fighting within ourselves, that's not really what we're about. We're really designed to sit around the campfire every night and chat and share feelings and have fun and blah, blah, blah. And you'd know everybody from the day you were born to the day you died. That's how we live for millions of years, right? That's how we work. But modern societies, they don't do that. It's all about competing for your place, proving yourself, holding on to that, showing how tough you are. Don't have these emotions. And that's really such a con because it's teaching you how to not understand your mind, how to do the worst thing to your mind. And then, as you say, people begin to kind of get into these terrible states of us. What I loved that term, a hurricane of emotions. That's exactly. And the other point that you made, I think, when you were talking about your relationship with your partner, your girlfriend, is that because of your irritability, then you get irritable, then you feel even worse. You feel even more unlovable, even more undesirable because you're so fucking irritable. So round we go. So then I think you began to work through this. You began to see what it was. You had the courage, really, because it is a courageous thing to do to say, oh, whoa, 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 hang on a minute, hang on. Let me just stop about this. Let me look at this angle. Let me look at this. Let me see if I can begin to understand. Let's just see if I can talk to people, find out what the hell's going on in my brain. Because I didn't choose to have a brain like this, did I? And then you started to see it in other people. And that was something quite important, I think, of beginning to think about, well, actually, it's not just my journey, actually. There are a lot of men that are caught up in this stuff. And there are a lot of some very bad role models of men who haven't dealt with it, have not dealt with this stuff. And so they do all this macho stuff, because they just haven't dealt with the shit going on inside of them. But you wanted then to start to share your story and see if you could help other people, which is what your book's brilliant. I think your book's fantastic. Which your book is about. So how did that happen?
I got to this place where I was doing things for my recovery. I was firmly in the recovery zone now, where I was going to therapy and I was learning about myself and my mental health and what I had to do. And that was a whole process in itself. I pretty much just stepped back and stepped away from everything for about a year just to focus on myself. I quit my job. I was living with my parents at the time, so I was lucky to be able to do that. But quit my job. I just kind of removed myself from my friendship group, not completely, but we just come out of university, so there was still a lot of stuff around revolved around alcohol and clubbing and late nights and stuff. And I basically just removed myself and focused on myself. And that was a process. I remember early on in therapy, we would start to touch on some stuff which was a bit more difficult and brought up difficult emotions in me. And I asked the therapist if we could stop the session. The therapist said to me, we can stop, but this is the sort of thing you want to be able to confront because this is where the recovery is. And it took me time to understand that, time to learn how to kind of confront this stuff. So that was a real journey, which I went on, obviously made it through that. And I think that when you go through something like that, you don't come out quite the same person.
Right.
You have, you've seen not only the world but yourself in a different way. And I think you've gone to some of the lowest depths you can go to as a human, potentially even the lowest depth when you're thinking of taking your own life. There's probably not much lower you can get than that. So I think having lived in that period for so long, when you do come out of it and the clouds part, I think that it does fundamentally change how you view the world and perhaps how you want to show up in the world. And I think that I came out of that just with this real sense of purpose and passion and I need to do something about this. I went through all this just over 10 years ago. The conversation was very different around mental health then. There wasn't as much awareness as there was back then, and I think I came out with a bit of a fire at some of the misinformation I was seeing and the lack of support and the lack of help. So I started sharing stuff online, just just kind of to my network, which in itself was like the thought of it at the time was terrifying because no one knew. For so long I'd spent this time not telling anyone what I was going through. Then I told a small group of people as part of my recovery, And then I got to this point where, well, actually, I'm just going to talk about it publicly. But I was almost like, because I'd come out of it with this sort of different view on myself, I almost didn't care anymore what people were going to think of it, which was almost probably the best part I'd come out of this journey
Um,
with. So I did that. I just had an amazing response. I had all these messages from people that I was still in contact with, people I hadn't seen for years, over a decade. A lot of really nice messages, and I think that just spurred me on to do more of that. And so I went to work in the mental health space. I started writing about it even more publicly on LinkedIn, which wasn't really done 10 years ago. That wasn't really the place for it. But I think that's why I did it, because I was like, let's go to the places where people aren't doing this stuff. And again, it just built and built and built, and built up a load of followers on LinkedIn, and continued working in the mental health space. And the work was so rewarding and I loved it. And on the flip side, I could still see the challenge. I can still see the challenge today, 10 years on. I can still see some of the same stuff that I face repeating itself. You still see governments dragging their heels, and, faulty beliefs in society persist. So I think that's where my passion for them wanting to do a book came from. Like, I wanted to really sort of put a proper contribution into the space that wasn't just a social media post, a 2,000 character social media post where nuance dies and you can't, fully get across your ideas. So the book was kind of the culmination of all of that. But I wrote it. This isn't just for me. I wrote it because I genuinely believe it's needed. Like, I really, really, really do. And I wish I could get it into the hands of everyone. Yeah, that would be my dream with it.
yeah, I think that's one. I mean, the key thing is the first thing I think is to de-shame men. Don't be ashamed of this stuff, right? This is what your brain is doing. When I had I was lucky because my wife was very matter of fact, and because I'd had a very bad time, and I got terrible panic attacks. Sometimes I couldn't go into Sainsbury's, I couldn't face the baked beans. No, I can't face the pastries, and I would have to stand outside. She said, "Don't worry, you've had a bad time. You'll be okay. It'll all settle down." And because I was a brain state theorist, I kind of realized, hang on a minute, something's happened to my brain here. What the hell is going on? It's got fuzzled or some way. So I was able to kind of not get too caught up in the challenging of it, but wanted to understand it. And that's been my life's work, as you know, and what happens in your head when these things happen. But the point, I think, why I love your book is because you're helping men recognize that brains are really complicated. I mean, they will, nobody teaches you how the damn thing works. But when you begin to see how they work, and if we're honest with our feelings, so we be able to tolerate our feelings and work with these things, then the lights come on. And I think that's why I would say your book is really good on that. So
Yeah.
in terms of that, so you started to write about your in social media and so forth. And what kind of messages would you start giving to men who may be beginning to recognize your story? I mean, what would you say to them?
I think the way that I really, really try to reach men is I think about what I needed to hear 10 years ago. And I think that the message is still very, very similar, in that mental health can be quite a hard conversation for men to get into and to understand. I think a lot of men can find mental health quite abstract as a concept, particularly if it's something they've been told to never talk about and to never
Yeah.
face. If a man has been told for decades to never talk about this thing, and then suddenly the message is talk about your mental health, it's just too jarring. So the way that I've been reaching men, and it's a big focus of the book, as you'll have seen, is I think the more we talk about specific topics and challenges and things that men are facing every day, the things they're actually sat with, I think that's how we draw them into the conversation. And that means talking about things like addictions, sexual function issues, hair loss, body image, eating disorders, money, fatherhood, work, purpose, all of these topics, some of which we talk about, some of which as a society we don't like to touch. But realistically, these are the things that men are sat with, and these are the things they're carrying. And I think that's how we can draw men into the conversation. And if we're talking about these things, then we're having better conversations on masculinity and on men's mental health. Like if we're talking about something like hair loss, for example, we're talking about hair loss. I mean, we're talking about mental health because we're talking about identity and self-worth and confidence and identity, all this kind of stuff. Like I had a hair transplant just over a year ago. I talk about that online. I've had more men reach out to me in the last year on hair loss specifically than I have on mental health in almost 10 years because I think it gives them the entry point that they understand. It gives them the kind of launch pad, and they'll come in very kind of be very functional conversation. It will just be, where did you go? How much did it cost? Did it hurt? And then I'll always ask, how are you doing with it? How are you feeling? And that's when it opens the door and they'll say, oh, actually, it's a bit crap. Or, yeah, I'm avoiding getting in photos or I'm avoiding going on nights out. And then we'll just ladder it down. And before you know it, maybe not always, but before you know it, we're into a conversation around mental health and shame and anxiety. But I had to sort of ladder down from the piece they understood. Whereas I think if I was only writing about the feelings of shame and not hair loss, I think you'll find a lot of men might resist the conversation. So that's what I have found has been really useful. And then I think once men are kind of in, again, the message is often just talk about it, just go and talk. But again, that's really, really challenging. It's really hard. It's still hard for me to talk now, sometimes even being in this space. I think if you've got a man that has been told for, again, decades to never talk, and the message is just talk about it, that's really challenging. So for me, then it's just firstly reframing the perception around emotions for men. So talk about these very specific topics and then reframe the perception around emotion. Don't just jump straight to the talk part, but try to get that man to understand that whatever he's sat with, it's just a biological function. It's there for a purpose.
Yeah.
It's not good or bad. It's just a biological function. Because you can't kind of work with something and process it until you've understood it. So that's the first step. And then it's how do you process that emotion? And I tell men, for some men that is going to be talking. It'd be great if everyone talks. That's not going to be the thing everyone jumps to. It's just finding a way of processing that emotion. Might be going for a run, might be meditating, might be going to a gym and punching a boxing bag or whatever it is. Just as long as we're then getting more men to understand this process of, okay, I'm going to face something in my life. It's going to bring up emotions. Those emotions are normal and I can sit with them. And then I'm going to find a way of processing them, which, hopefully is talking and you are bringing other people in on what you're going through. But there are also other ways of processing this stuff. So that's kind of the message I try to give out, which I hope is a bit more sort of nuanced than just slapping, oh, just talk about it on a tube ad or whatever. Which very very well meaning, of course, and I want that for everyone. But I also recognise that it's not always as easy as that, right?
Yeah, that's such a brilliant point. I mean, and the big thing was, of course, men, particularly as they growing up, is impotence. Should I? That's the issue, and helping men understand. Well, unfortunately, it's very common because it's linked to nitric oxide, and the way these things work, the sexual organize the way your sexual systems are organized is just ridiculous. I mean, whoever developed a system like penile erections, I mean, it's terrible because it can go wrong so easily. You think, who on earth designed this? And
Yeah.
of course, nature designed it, and it's not designed to work for very long because we're supposed to be dead by the time we're 40, whatever. So just helping men understand that the physiological changes that are happening in men. I mean, there's a big movement now for women to understand the menopause and all of that, which is fantastic. But I think there's same issues for men understanding things like how your sexual function works, why it doesn't work sometimes, what's that's about that's not your fault, because it's a terrible, terrible source of shame and issue of the hair loss and so forth. So I love this point about reaching men through specific areas of shame. I think that's such an important thing and helping them realize it's absolutely not your fault at all. It's because of how the damn thing's designed.
Yeah, and I think the two examples you said there are probably the key ones: hair loss and then impotence. And you may be throwing in. There's a couple others you could probably throw in there around like money as well. Are you
Yeah,
making enough money? Those tend to be the things that men attach themselves to, and where the
yeah,
feelings of shame are the greatest. I think because we come back to this sort of masculine code, what men have been taught they should do, quote unquote, and that is be physically strong, be sexually active, make a load of money, and that's kind of it. So if any of these things are lacking, your sexual ability or your appearance, men, whether they realize it or not, they immediately jump to, I'm not man enough. I'm not
Yeah,
good enough of a man.
yeah, yeah,
And that, as we know, carries so much emotional weight.
yeah. Because it makes you feel inferior and therefore an outsider and therefore not you can't fit in anymore. And that is linked to this incredible sense of loneliness. I mean, the key again, I think that's in your book, is that actually when all of that sits, what it leaves you with this intense sense of loneliness, completely disconnected in the dark by yourself on your own. Not, you're not wanted, you're not good enough, you're out of it. And that is an incredibly painful position. It's frightening, actually. And, you do get suicidal feelings out of that intense sense. It's just, I just can't do it. I just can't. There's no place for me in the world. I can't, you know. And so I think all of these things, the shame around these different things you talked about, but underneath it is this deep loneliness and helping
Yeah,
men understand that, own it, own that loneliness, own the fact, I don't want to be lonely. I don't
yeah,
want to be, I don't want to be
yeah,
lonely. I want to be connected. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I think, as I discovered with my own journey, we've talked about we've described it in different ways here. I talked about this hurricane of emotions. We talked about the loneliness, the shame. I think we 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 ignore this stuff, as I did in my own journey. I ignored it, thinking that if I ignore it for long enough, it will go away.
Yeah.
And actually, what I had to come to learn, and what I'm really keen for other people to learn, is that this stuff doesn't just go on its own. Emotions are kind of stored in the body. If we ignore them, they just store there, and it builds like pressure, and that pressure, it has to come out eventually. It's going to reach an unmanageable level, and it has to go. When you've got too much pressure, it's going to, the thing holding it's going to break, and it has to go somewhere eventually. Might be soon, might not be for decades. But I think a lot of the devastating statistics we're seeing around men, health, mental health, addictions, crime, all this kind of stuff, I think is partly down to this pressure just having to find a way out. I think addictions are a great example where they're often someone's way of coping with the pain that they're avoiding. So, the big thing for me with this work, as I know you do with your work around compassion, is helping people confront the things they're feeling in order to release them in a healthy way before that pressure builds to an unmanageable
Yeah.
level.
I think it's very important. And although we're talking about men, I mean, women face these things as well. The social demands on them to look good, to whatever. They go around having plastic surgery and having to make up every day. They have to put their makeup on. So,
Yep.
it's although we're talking about men, these pressures to become a social norm and do it in the appropriate way are bad for both of us, both genders, really. And
Yeah.
I think the way men and women can begin to have these discussions with each other so we don't put pressure on each other to be some kind of, whatever. I think that's really, really important. Men need to talk with themselves, but we also need to talk with the women and talk. We don't want to be caught up in all these social pressures. We want to just find out what it is to relate, what it is to make meaningful, caring relationships, compassionate relationships, understanding, all of that stuff, really, which again, you talk about in your book. So, one of the themes that we've sort of talked about is the way in which modern cultures really are pretty bad for both genders, actually. So, what would you like to see change? I mean,
Mm,
how can we begin to change the
mm.
cultural dialogues and get people to understand how your brain actually works, understand how
Yep.
nature's built your mind. Don't try and make it up.
One of the things about humans, which is probably a blessing and a curse, is we like to simplify things, right? We like to just strip things down, simplify them, make them binary, strip away all nuance, which, it has its benefits and it has its real harms. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing with the conversation around men and women, culturally, societally. I think we have created these concepts, masculinity and femininity, and then we've put them in separate boxes, and we've listed a bunch of traits that those, masculinity or femininity has. And from a very young age, we put boys in one box and girls in another box, and we kind of have tricked them into believing that's it, that you're meant to be a specific way. And so if a boys in particular, they grow up believing that masculinity means you have to always be strong and tough and show grit and leadership and be independent, figure things out for yourself. And obviously for women, we tell them they should be the compassionate ones, the emotional ones, the caregivers. And these things, we've arrived at this place because there are some roots in biology. There is some order to some of this stuff, but we have oversimplified it and we have tricked people into believing that it's only biology, and it's not. It's not these two separate binary boxes. The reality is that all of these traits sit on a spectrum, and we all sit on that spectrum. It's a sliding scale, and we all have access to all of these traits, in different amounts, different points, different averages, but we all have access to them. So, strength is not an exclusively masculine trait. Emotional vulnerability is not an exclusively female trait, or feminine trait. But I think that's the trick that we have taught people. So I think for me it starts with breaking those boxes down, and breaking those barriers down, and helping people realize, as you said, we're all, at the end of the day, we're all humans. We're all human beings. We all sit at slightly different points on this scale, but we are all human beings, and we all have the ability and also the right to tap into all of these things at different points and to feel things at different points. And there are times for strength and resilience and grit and toughness. We don't have to shut those parts down. I think, again, we talk about stuff going too binary. I think a conversation around masculinity can sometimes get too binary. And some men think that this conversation means shutting down those parts, and they see it as an attack, so they withdraw more. But it's not about that. There are times when we can be competitive and strong and tough. We can celebrate that. But it's also about recognizing there's times for all the other stuff as well. There's times for compassion and empathy and vulnerability and connection and community and all this sort of stuff. So I think we just, the more we can make this less binary, the more we can bring some nuance back into the conversation, the better. Sadly, that has not been helped by the rise of social media and algorithms and influencers who, you're not rewarded for nuance and social media. You're rewarded for black and white thinking and often extremes. So this conversation is getting tougher and tougher to have publicly because, my book, for example, I've deliberately taken the route of compassion and respectfulness and balance and nuance, which ultimately is not the thing that is going to sell as well as if I'd taken a really, controversial take. But I believe that this is how we have to approach this conversation. We have to approach it with more nuance and stop making it so binary, because humans aren't that simple, right? As you've already said, the brain is a very, very complex thing, and we've oversimplified it far too much.
And one of the things I like in your book also is this idea of competitiveness, because we males can be very competitive, and the concept of, I think, respectful competitiveness. That respectful competitiveness is, in competitiveness, there's the promotion of the self. You want to do well, and blah blah blah. And there's another aspect which is actually to suppress subordinates, to inhibit them, to undermine them. And respectful competitiveness is actually you support each other. I mean, in sport, for example, coaches can go all over the world, and somebody would play for England cricket and go and coach somebody in India. The idea of this respectful competition, in other words, competition is important. Yeah, we can compete and we can enjoy that and so forth, but it doesn't have to be this aggressive and contemptuous forms, which is what you get in some guys that are very fragile guys that haven't sorted out this stuff. Then their way they compete is much more in terms of it's about being aggressive and all that, as opposed to being talented. And I think, again, you kind of touch on that in your book, and that is important, I think, because when we're talking about these masculine things, then value, if you enjoy competitive games and compete to the best, but do it respectfully and so on. I think that's a key thing. I mean, I've played competitive cricket, and I play with people who will bowl, they'll bowl at you. They want to really get you out. But
Yeah.
after the game, it's like just great, you know. So these kind of issues about masculine competitiveness, what it is, and it doesn't have to be, you know, destructive. It can be promote well-being and so on and so on. A sense of communication and sharing, all of that stuff. I think, which is you touched on in your book, is really really important. The other thing I was going to ask you is, what do you think we should do in the schools? Because my feeling is that there's not enough done in the schools to help children understand the nature of their minds and understand the nature of the challenges that the men and boys and girls are facing, really. Do you think we should be doing more stuff with the children and stuff?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. You know, I look at my own journey, and so much of my journey was worsened and lengthened because of the lack of knowledge that I had. You know, I didn't know what I was feeling. I didn't know where it had come from. I didn't know these labels. I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't think I could do anything about it being a man. So so much of my journey was extended because of that. And then I had to go into this place of a lot of self-learning. You know, once I started to get these labels, okay, it's depression, but then I had to almost go into a lot of Googling, a lot of researching. I bought books because I was trying to understand, like, why is my mind doing this? Like, what does it mean? I was trying to understand it on an emotional level, a chemical level, a scientific level. I was having to go through all that. And
Yeah,
I say this a lot, that would that journey been as long as it was if I had had a better education around this stuff from a younger age? Obviously, you know, you can't answer that question completely, but I believe it to be no. You know, I believe that I wouldn't have got to the place I had if I had been better equipped at a younger age. I think particularly as, you know, you're going through a lot of stuff when you're growing up, right? You're going through a lot of stuff when you're young. There's a lot of stuff that's hard to handle, and you know, you don't feel equipped to do it, and you know, life comes at you quite fast, and you maybe not got the kind of emotional awareness for it yet. So that's particularly when we need to help people, young kids and teenagers going through all of that stuff. So I think we need to do way, way more. And it's not just around mental health. You know, it's a common thing people say that, you know, you learn a bunch of stuff at school that you never go and use again. We need to teach people more about other life things. So, you know, that's a very commonly shared belief. So it's, you know, nothing kind of groundbreaking I'm saying, but I do really believe it. Like, you know, people suddenly come out of uni and they're hit with things like mortgages and taxes and relationship troubles and sexual function issues that we talked about, and, you know, maybe declining health in family members, just all this stuff that you're not prepared for. And I think often people's lessons come about from them going through the thing and something bad happening for them to then realize they need to do something about it. As was the case for me with my mental health, it took me getting to the place of almost taking my own life to then understand and learn about emotions, which is ridiculous when you think about it, because we all have emotions. So why are we not taught about them from a younger age? So, you know, I definitely think we need to do more. We obviously need to do more to support people of any generation, but if we want to kind of stop the rot, just stop this becoming a constant cycle, we need to start younger as well.
yeah, I do agree. And the other thing that in conversations we've had previously that, as you know, is deeply concerning is certain types of Western culture. Like, you know, a lot of the movies now, you know, excitement movies are good guys against bad guys. So you have the bad guys and they do terrible things. And then the good guys come in and they often are becoming increasingly sadistic in their vengeance. And everybody says, oh, this is so exciting. Yeah, let's see him, you know, throw him on the fire, blah, blah. That's quite serious. What's being fed into kids and men in terms of excitement with these superheroes that are basically finding ways to act out vengeance. Mm, we as men, we need to have a discussion about that. I mean, if that, you know, we want to say to Hollywood, if that's the only version you are selling this masculinity, it's not right. You know,
Yeah.
there are many other aspects of masculinity which are to do with compassion and courage and so on and so on. This constantly making money out of men hurting other men is immoral, I think,
Yeah.
personally. I mean, it's exciting and you get, you know, you get lots of money out of it, but actually, do we really want to feed that? Do we want to feed that into our societies all the time? So that is a big conversation that we all, as men, all need to have. Yeah, watching these movies are exciting, but what's it doing to our brains? What's it doing to
Yeah.
our views about good and bad? What's it doing to how we deal with some of the darker side of human nature?
Yeah,
It's
yeah, I agree. I completely agree. Same with like video games. It's kind of
yeah,
the thing that
absolutely.
people are pulled to, boys are pulled to is stuff with guns, basically.
Yeah, right.
There's a certain, I always try to look at both sides. I'm like, it's if it's a hobby that people enjoy, then there's something in that. But also, as you say, what are we teaching people? And I think we need better messages and better ways of doing this and the stuff that we're putting out. I think something like Game of Thrones, for example. I don't know if you've seen it. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of violence and action and stuff in that, which is one part. But if I focus specifically on how they approach the characters, the author George Martin talks very very clearly about how he approached the characters in that book, where he says that often we approach this stuff from a very very binary point of view. As you say, it's literally good versus bad, and the bad people always tend to look a certain way. They're really grotesque and they're dressed in black and they always have these kind of wildly dramatic, sadistic plans, as you say. But he says that that's just not real life. With real life, we all kind of have a bit of good and bad in us. We've all got the happiness and the pain. We've all got a bit of struggle in us, and there's a lot more kind of moral ambiguity than is often reflected in cinema. So when he's the way he's created the characters, if you've watched it, you'll go through the show hating some characters, then you feel sorry for them, then you love them, then they'll do something again that you hate, and then you can understand their reasons why they're doing it. They're doing it because of love or family or whatever it might be. And you kind of go on this journey with so many characters where they're presented as a much more, yeah, it's much more morally ambiguous, but that's kind of reality, and you can understand where some people's convictions are coming from. But I think there's more of that in media these days. But when I was growing up, I mean, that was part of the reason I think I felt like I'd failed as a man, because there was just none of that. It was all just action films. The men, were just built like, stacked with muscle. They did stunts, which obviously are impossible, just gravity defying stunts. But that was all you saw. That was all was on TV. And then, all I saw on the billboards was Calvin Klein models, men that looked a certain way. That was the only kind of body type I saw. So it was just culturally, you're absorbing these messages. Like even if you don't watch the film, you see the movie poster, you see how they look, and you see what they do in the trailer, and you absorb it. You take that on and think, particularly as a kid, I used to look at this stuff, used to watch James Bond and think, well, I don't look like that, and I can't do that. So am I not a real man? And I think it's not healthy. So we are getting better at putting out, kind of more balanced messages these days, but then do we do a good enough job of promoting them? We've already talked about social media and algorithms. I don't think we do in social media, and I think that you said earlier that we quickly kind of go to blaming men or boys for the way they're feeling. We put it all on them. We don't often ask the question of what are we doing systemically and societally that is making them
Absolutely.
feel that way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things we've talked about briefly is that increasingly now men are getting interested in peace. And this is important because if we look at the history, men have slaughtered other men in the most horrific ways for thousands of years. Enough, right? Enough. Right? We don't want to keep being pulled into tribal violence, and getting our legs blown off in some war somewhere. And how men need to stand up. That's the courage we need in the world at the moment to say, look, we're not just fodder for these armies. We're not. We need our politicians to be peacemakers, not war makers, and so on and so on. And we need to demand that. So,
Yeah.
if you look what's happened in Ukraine, I mean, what is it now? 500,000 people have all been slaughtered. I mean, it's just nuts. That's nuts. To allow a world where you have leaders like this is nuts. And so all of us as men, because we're the fodder, we're the ones that are going to get ourselves blown up. We have to say to leaders, you got to sort it out between yourselves, right? Otherwise, you don't deserve to be a leader. So I think
Yeah.
what I like about your book is saying that, working with our own mental stuff, working with our own mental pain, working with our own understanding our own minds also gives us the courage to think about, but I want to create a more compassionate world. And that's on many levels, not just about dealing with myself, but also recognizing that if we don't, we just allow men to do these things, they just become fodder for somebody else's bombs. And that's just not right. I don't want that. And so that brings us to the last question that we've got here about um, what do you see as a healthier version of masculinity, particularly in terms of how we create a courageous, wise compassion for men? Men,
Mm.
compassion is not about just being kind, it's just that is good, but there's a real courage to compassion, there's a real determination to kind of get on top of the destructive side of our own minds and the destructive side of that, where we can be harmful to other people. How do you see that?
Yeah. Yeah. And, what you talked around there around these leaders around the world, these warmongering leaders, they're a perfect example of what an unhealthy version of masculinity looks like. If
Absolutely.
really they are deeply unstable individuals,
Yeah.
deeply unstable, and they're waging this wars probably because they're avoiding some of their own deep trauma, pain, struggle, whatever it is, and they have a really extreme way of trying to fill that. But they're the perfect example of people that just do not have a balanced version of masculinity. And I think that that kind of leads me to, well, what does a healthy version look like? And we've talked about it kind of throughout this episode, but really it's that ability to recognize that we are human beings first and foremost. We've put these binary labels on stuff, masculinity, femininity, whatever it might be. We are human beings first and foremost, and that means we are going to feel and experience the full range of human emotion and human experience, and we're all going to go through stuff. We can tell ourselves that we're as strong, the strongest person in the world, the strongest man in the world, but you could suddenly next week be confronted with losing a job, then losing a family member, losing your home, whatever it might be. You could be confronted with that, and you're going to face that as a human being, and you're going to feel the things that come with that. And there's no medal for just trying to be stoic through that and avoiding it and just saying that you're gonna just gonna avoid it and feel nothing. You don't kind of get reward points for that. And actually the path where that can lead you if you do avoid it could be really dangerous. I know that in myself that it almost cost me my own life. So I think there's a way of being balanced here and about looking at being a human being, and how that looks is different to everyone. There's not sort of a 10-point blueprint here of how to be a man that, if I give you this, you just follow that and then you're a healthy version of a man, because everyone looks slightly different. That's what being a human being is about. But I think it's just about recognizing that, okay, there is more than one way to be a man, and there are many traits and emotions that men have been told to shut off to that actually are normal and natural, and we should sit with them and confront them. As you say, that means confronting the difficult stuff as well. As hard as that is, doesn't mean it's going to be an enjoyable experience. It might be uncomfortable and unpleasant, but that is just part of being human. So I think that's really what I say to people. It's less about trying to be more of a man, it's just about trying to be more of a human. I think for a long time that's what men haven't been doing. They've fit themselves into this very narrow box of, well, let's just be strong and tough, and let's avoid my pain, and then I'm being a man, I'm doing the right thing. But actually, that often comes at great expense. That might be at the expense of your life, but if it's not, it might be at the expense of lost love and connection and time and purpose that you've shut yourself off from, and that's not good for anyone.
Oh, indeed, causing harm to other people. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. I think trying to be the best human we can be, okay? Because humans have evolved into being potentially one of the most compassionate species on this planet. We also have the potential to be the most vicious,
Yeah.
cruel, nasty. We have to choose, right?
Hmm.
To choose. And I think your book is a fantastic journey about how to choose. Okay. So
Thanks,
on
Paul.
that point, I'm going to say thank you so much for a wonderful discussion, George. A brilliant book. which I hope does very well, and lots of people read it. It's a great inspiration for men, really, and for men to find themselves and to have some fun. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul. Been a pleasure.